amongst the many datasheets of 40k 10th edition, which units are the single weakest ones for each faction in the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where here on the channel I often focus on some of the strongest stuff in the game in 40k. Though I thought in this video it might be interesting to take a look at the other end of the spectrum, units that very rarely see the table outside of more fun and fluffy games, and are kind of unlikely to justify themselves in most competitive lists. For this video I thought we'd talk through each army in Warhammer 40k in turn, focus on one unit that I think is perhaps particularly standout weak for its points cost at the moment, and maybe a few of the reasons that it just doesn't really bring all that much to the table. For a few of the factions it is kind of obvious, I think, though for some factions I feel like there's multiple viable contenders for weakest unit in the army, and I will try and mention a few honourable mentions and other near misses as we go along. I'm sure I won't catch literally everything though. It is perhaps just a little bit arbitrary. You could argue things being flat out bad versus redundant, and I sort of feel like I want to focus a little bit more on the core unit and character choices, as opposed to things that are cloned across multiple different codexes, or flies or fortifications, which do seem to be kind of chronically unfavoured in 10th edition so far, so I might try and do a little bit of both there. For this one I am going to ignore Forge World, just given that there's quite a lot of big stuff that isn't really intended to be all that competitive in game, and that might be for the best, plus quite a lot of their datasheets seem to be pointed at a level that they're supposed to be somewhat niche. I think in general Games Workshop want to have the core of your force focused around the actual index or codex and the plastic choices they have, rather than pushing too many people into the arms of Forge World resin, which not everyone wants to pick up. I might make a couple of exceptions for Knights and Custodes, however, given that Forge World makes up quite a big chunk of their ranges. In any case, let's jump straight into it, and let me know if you think that there's anything that you would have ranked differently, particularly if there's any weak choices that don't make it in as an honourable mention. First up, and starting with Space Marines, they do have a rather enormous unit roster, and maybe not too surprising that a few things get neglected, though I'd argue that they maybe haven't done too badly in keeping everything at least sort of mid-tier. Perhaps one of the very standout weak units though might be the Reaver Lieutenant, a pretty cheap support character that gives his squad lethal hits, which definitely isn't too bad, but in general Reavers just don't tend to be the unit that you really want to build around from a damage point of view. Even with lethal hits, a whole bunch of strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1 hits aren't really going to be punching up against tanks or 2+ saves or things. In general, I think for the most part if I was taking Reavers, I'd want to keep them cheap, though if you did want to buy a Lieutenant in, then it'd almost certainly be the Phobos Lieutenant. That guy gives them an interesting move-shoot-move that then still allows them to charge, so if they want to they can pull weird deep strike and charge shenanigans, which is kind of fun. And I feel like that's just got so much more value than just pushing out their Battleshock debuff a little bit further, which is what the Reaver Lieutenant brings. The Reaver Lieutenant also lacks the grav shoot as well, so you can't even deep strike him if you want the rest of the Reavers to. All of that combined with a melee profile that's only strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1 means that I just don't think it adds very much in a unit that you don't really want to support that much for the most part anyway. Otherwise for Space Marines, maybe other shoutouts could be for the Hammerfall Bunker. That thing got brutally took down a peg after Games Workshop heavily nerfed its Overwatch style ability. I feel like it had some niche use before, but now really doesn't. Tactical Marines and Reavers are kind of stand out for being overshadowed by other Space Marine infantry choices. They aren't maybe a million miles from being usable, but just overcosted at this point. And otherwise there's a fair bit of stuff that are put more in the underwhelming sort of category. Invade ATVs and Outriders. The Ancient rarely tends to be the best choice for the Primaris Tacticus armoured stuff. And the Stormflyers, particularly the Stormhawk and Stormtalon, tend to be a bit on the overcosted side, I think. I thought I'd also just skim through the Divergent Space Marine chapters as well. For their unique units, I feel like the Space Wolves are pretty badly let down by their Wolf Scouts currently. They're definitely a unit that compared badly to standard Space Marine Scout squads in the first place, as they cost really quite a lot. 80 points for a squad of them, whereas a regular Scout squad is 55 points, and in general you don't really gain very much at all for having Wolf Scouts on the board. They get the option of a couple of special weapons and a Power Fist on the Sergeant, which is absolutely nowhere near worth that points increase. Otherwise for the Death Watch I'd probably choose Captain Artemis. He's 75 points for an opportunity to double spend on stratagems for your unit, but he doesn't give you the nice free stratagems like regular captains do. And otherwise he's basically just a standard sort of brawler character with a rule to get back up when he dies, though it's not as exciting on him as it requires your entire squad to have got wiped out already. which generally means that you're losing out even before that happens. He wasn't really ever being taken in competitive Death Watch lists before things like the Proteus Kill Team and the Death Watch veterans now regained access to all the standard Space Marine characters again. So now he's competing directly against lieutenants and captains. I hardly think that he's going to get a look in now. Otherwise, beyond that, I feel like there's at least some arguments that you can make for literally anything else in the index. Maybe Kill Team Cassius does seem a bit of a weird offering. A lot of damage profiles that don't really add up to too much for the 250 plus points that you pay. At least they do come with some fun special rules and objective control too, though. They are at least reasonably interesting for skirmishing with medium infantry on midfield objectives, though I think that in general you'd usually want to take one of the other kill teams. For the Blood Angels, I would probably pick Death Company Tycho at 90 points. Not entirely sure why he's more expensive than the standard golden armoured version one that you can see pictured here. He's a support character for Foot's Death Company, which maybe isn't the best start given that you often want the jump pack ones to actually get into melee in a timely fashion. His melee profile is pretty awful. He loses his actually okay command abilities to give you say things like Rapid Fire 1, and somehow that all comes with an increased points cost. His only real value is giving Foot's Death Company Advance and Charge, which I guess isn't awful. I really don't think that it's worth 90 points worth a very underwhelming character beyond that though, and it's even more redundant if you're playing Gladius when you could access that for 1 CP anyway. Otherwise, a few of the other characters aren't particularly stand out, and maybe the Furioso Dreadnought isn't that exciting. Perhaps the Sanguinary Guard do stand out as a unit that's just kind of depressingly mid-tier at the moment. They could really use a points cut to actually make them compete as a strong option for the faction. Next up for the Black Templars, and these guys are pretty much the strongest Space Marines around at the moment. For their unique stuff in the index, it is genuinely hard to pick a choice, given that just about everything is usable, and you're just left with a choice of things that aren't absolutely standout good for their cost. I guess if I had to select something, it would probably be the Emperor's Champion for 75 points. Even he is certainly not awful though, he is merely just a fairly good brawler character with strength 8 and damage 3, and extra nice against characters. It's more the case that the other special characters in the Crusader squads and the Sword Brethren are all just better for their points, I think. And the standard Castellan and Marshal are pretty much just side grades in equipment compared with the standard Captain and Lieutenant. It's kind of hard really to see them as different units, but just more a different flavour of war gear for those miniatures. The tanks are all kind of great as well, just having a cheap extra multi-melter bolted on top does seem like a flat upgrade on already fairly cost-effective vehicles. There's really not a lot of bad things to say about the Black Templars index currently. Finally, for the Dark Angels, I'd probably give the most niche model award to Ezekiel for 75 points. He's a librarian with a few things going on. He does get a force weapon and a sniping sort of mind wipe rule, but overall I'd say his only really impressive boost is giving +1 attack to his unit, which would be okay perhaps if he could lead Blade Guard, but given that he can't lead anything in melee that's more punchy than Assault Intercessors, it's not really that good. His Your Turn Battle Shock rule is just kind of underwhelming given the timing of it too. Hopefully Games Workshop might give him some sort of updated rules to make him a bit more interesting than this when the Codex rolls around. I feel like he definitely needs something. Otherwise for the Dark Angels, there's quite a lot of stuff that feels somewhat underwhelming. Lazarus and Asmodai maybe don't add loads more value than Ezekiel to the units that they join, at least in my opinion. Hopefully Asmodai might get a little bit more exciting given that rather jazzy new miniature for him. Otherwise, out of their actual core units beyond characters, maybe the Ravenwing Dark Shroud might be one to look at. That one gives you an aura of the benefit of cover, when cover's really quite easy to get in 10th edition, and you're paying 125 points for this, you're probably just better off to get another fancy damage dealer of one sort or another. Perhaps the Land Speeder Vengeance if you're going Ravenwing, or just about anything else in terms of gun tanks will probably add more durability and damage to the board. Moving on from Space Marines, next up we have the Adeptus Custodes. Currently they're one of the weakest factions in the game right now, so have quite a lot of units to choose from that are either underwhelming or straight up bad. Perhaps if I was picking one unit from the core index, I might go for the Vigilators. 50 points for 4 Sisters of Silence here. These tend to be the ones that are least commonly run versus the Prosecutors and the Witch Seekers. The Prosecutors just being very cheap for 40 points for an expendable unit of grunts to sit on points and do secondaries and things. Whereas the Witch Seekers actually repel enemy light infantry quite well with their flamethrowers, and could maybe even threaten Overwatch if it made sense to. The Vigilators on the other hand get 2 attacks at Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 2 with Anti-Psyker and Devastating Wounds. At basically 12 or 13 points per model, I'd say that's not awful. They just don't really have any good support in the Custodes Codex really. And I feel like, in general, if you're looking for that kind of profile damage, that's the sort of thing that just about any Custodes melee units will put out anyway with their Guardian Spears, but at Strength 7 and Martial Catar benefits, as opposed to devastating wounds on it. The other issue is that unlike the big chunky Custodes models, these girls really have to think about what they charge. If they can't wipe out a unit, then they're probably best off just not charging it in the first place, as if even a few enemies live to swing back, you're probably going to lose a good chunk of your unit at Toughness 3. You might also want a Rhino as well to try and deliver them to combat, which is just adding yet more value to a section of the codex that's more often just taken in small numbers for objectives and things, at least in more optimized lists. Otherwise, as mentioned though, I feel like there's lots of things that could do with a boost in Custodes right now. Otherwise, out of the core codex, the Biker Virtus Praetors still feel like they're paying a bit much for what they do. And if you do look at the Forge World Rangers, basically half of the Custodes army is in that at the moment. The Coronis Transport rarely gets used, the Palace Gravitac doesn't do much damage, and the Orion Dropship is a very big and pricey miniature to be putting in your army for something that does have some damage threat but not excessive amounts, and you probably want the Shooting Dropship if you did take one of them. The Dreadnoughts aren't particularly exciting either. Overall, plenty of things that probably need a boost in one form or another, hopefully to try and get their win rate a bit closer to balanced. For the Adepta Sororitas, perhaps one of the single most eclipsed units might be the Missionary. He's a 30-point support character for sustained hits 1, but no real melee units that you actually want to take him in, making him a pretty disappointing support character all in all. The unit that should be very excited about having him to lead them would be the Arco-Flagellants. They're exactly the sort of fairly blendy combat unit that would like any boost that they can get, but unfortunately they already have sustained hits on their base profile, so they can't gain anything from him. Otherwise, Crusaders just come in 2 small squads to really justify a buffing unit in them. And for the Battle Sister options that he can join, you might be better off with something like a Palatine with the Relic Blade that they can take. Lethal hits plus some actual fighting threat of their own just seems so much better. Hopefully that's something that they think through a little bit harder in the next codex that comes out, I guess. Otherwise, beyond that, I feel like the Dogmata is really quite niche at the moment. And again, throughout the rest of the codex, there's a lot of the more fancy damage dealers that you'd hope will be very dangerous that just aren't right now. Retributors and Repentia and Dominions, I feel like could all go down a little bit. I feel like they're not in the point where they're 100% unusable, but just don't have anywhere near enough threat for their points for how fragile they are. Moving on to the Admech with their new codex, some of the units that seem to be sticking out as some of the very weakest around are maybe Belisarius Core and the Archaeopter Transvector. Core did drop 5 points in the new book, going down to 180, but he also lost his Aura of Stealth and traded it for an Aura of Cover. Again, probably not the most useful overall, given that you can often get that on the board anyway. Otherwise, he gives a basic reroll 1s to hit aura, which isn't awful, but maybe a bit underwhelming for a faction commander. And while his overall damage and defense is okay, it's fairly tough and packs a bit of scary shooting and a bunch of random melee attacks, he still seems to be a unit that's just significantly overcosted, and to see more play in competitive lists will either need to drop by quite a bit or gain a significant ability boost. The Transvector, on the other hand, is basically like a Dune Rider but way worse given the points cost. 140 points for a flyer that can start on the board in hover mode and then move forward to drop off a squad somewhere in the midfield. The big advantage is that it can get you a unit where it needs to be. A 20-inch movement with the option to drop after that really does give them good threat range, but you just pay an absolutely enormous premium for that at 60 points over a Dune Rider, and Dune Riders I think did get a fair bit better in the codex, with things like reroll wound rolls on offer now. Between all that, it just seems unlikely to be the choice that you'd take when it costs so much more, and the Dune Rider is very usable. I would say that the Fusilier isn't really much better than this either, only having a weak bombing attack that averages about 3 mortal wounds. It was a unit that I never really saw taken before, and now arguably I'd say that its bombing ability got worse compared with the tiny points decrease it got, so it's probably looking worse than ever in the new book. For the Astra Militarum, perhaps the boring and obvious answer is the Aegis Defense line at 145 points. Again, you can throw that in with all the other fortifications that are just weirdly overcosted. A 4+ invulnerable save definitely isn't bad for infantry squads taking cover in your deployment zone, it's just not going to be worth 145 points. If you took that in Kazachan Jungle Fighters, that could get you almost an extra 30 bodies on the board. I feel like that's going to add more defense and objective threats than a static fortification ever would. Otherwise though, for overcosted things, maybe for a similar sort of reason to the Transvector, I'd also rank the Valkyrie here. This one's even more than the Transvector at a massive 200 points. It is at least fairly tanky, with 14 wounds with a 2+ save, so it is going to need some dedicated anti-tank fire to bring it down, but its damage output is kind of awful. A single las cannon plus a couple of rocket pods and heavy bolters, way less than a very shooty Russ that you could get for these points, and it is competing with the rather excellently costed Chimeras at just 70 points now. Those things might be a little bit easier to take out and don't move anywhere near as far, but their damage threat is actually not really too far off the Valkyries for the 200 points it pays, and of course you could basically get 3 Chimeras for the cost of 1 Valkyrie, transporting far more infantry into battle should you wish to play mechanised. Again, probably a unit that could see a very big points cut and might still be rarely taken. Otherwise, the Death Strike might be another solid contender. It did get quite a lot worse with the 10th edition update. The missile for the points cost is just in the territory where a lot of the time the opponent could just happily take the damage and not really care too much. Maybe move the odd critical squad slightly out of the way. It just isn't quite the giant deletion laser of doom that can move your opponent's units around for fear of dire consequences. I don't think it was really a unit that needed to go up in the points cost increases that hit all the indirect fire stuff. For the Grey Knights, following one round of points updates, I feel like they managed to get the majority of their units in the index at least somewhat usable, more into the region of just being a bit underwhelming as opposed to being truly awful. Perhaps the worst units beyond that might be the Stormhawk and Storm Talon. In theory could be perhaps a source of a little bit of longer range heavy firepower for the Grey Knights, but they're really not costed to be able to do that, and they don't really have any other synergy with the rest of the faction's options. Perhaps the fact that the rest of the army has kind of godly mobility anyway means that these guys are just even more niche, as you're paying a big premium for them to get around the board quite quickly. Otherwise, for underwhelming stuff, the Servitors are 50 points, and even for a very cheap placeholder unit that's rarely going to get looked at too much, you're probably better off with Inquisitorial Henchmen for a similar sort of cost. At least they're tougher and have better OC. Otherwise, out of their unique stuff, maybe the basic Dread Knights are still in a position where they're just not doing the job that they need to. Ideally, they should hopefully be putting in a bit more work against tough enemy units, but still in a position where they're just kind of unexcitingly pointed for their damage and defense. The Purgation Squad might be giving them a bit of a run for their money for the lowest spot for more unique Grey Knight units as well. Finally, for the Imperium, we come to the Imperial Knights, and for these guys I'd probably give it to the Knight Preceptor for 430 points. This one's the one with the Las Impulsor, but is the generic offering that isn't Canis Rex, and it really does suffer from the comparison. It's basically like Canis Rex, but much worse, for only 30 points less. The Las Impulsor just isn't really that great without Canis' sustained hits and hitting on a 2+. You do get to reroll against one nominated target, which could help out a little, but from then on you wouldn't be very flexible if you actually want somewhat good damage output. Otherwise, its bondsman ability I'd rate as one of the worst ones. Leadership and OC every so often could be big if it manages to secure you an objective with an injured armiger or something, but for the majority of times, and I guess the majority of games overall, it's probably going to do literally nothing. And that just makes it a lot less reliable than something that amps up some raw damage defense or mobility. Beyond that, it's just got loads of competition from the other Questoris as well, many of which are a lot more exciting, like the Crusader, maybe the Warden and Canis Rex himself. There's only so many big knights that you can take in an army, and he is not going to get a look in most forces. Otherwise, if we did expand things to Forge World for the Imperial Knights, I'd probably also mention the Acheron as well. That's the one with the big flamethrower. This one had pretty bad stats just in damage and defense all the way through. I would have ranked it as one of the worst Imperial Knights in general anyway, but since Games Workshop decrees that Titanic models can no longer fire Overwatch, he just sunk to an even new low, with the one reason that you might want to take one basically removed. The Valiant was also not happy about that Overwatch change either. Moving on to the Forces of Chaos, and first up we have the Felgor Beastmen for 95 points. These guys are quite a fun new kill team unit added to the game, though I feel like maybe they're one of the units that Games Workshop could have brought down a bit in their last balance pass. A fair few other things did go down, but these guys got passed over. Just in general, they're a chaff unit with toughness 4 and a 5+ save, but for 95 points that's really not good defense for the cost, and they don't really have good damage either. Mostly fairly basic close combat weapons with just a couple of very slightly heavier profiles mixed in that aren't particularly focused. I'd say the Scouts rule is the only major selling point for them, but I'm just not sure it's really enough compared with the other alternatives. I feel like the vast majority of Chaos lists will be taking a Cursed Cultist if they did want some slightly bigger investment for chaff to throw towards objectives, or perhaps just Cultist or Traitor Guardsman if you wanted low investment squads with a bit of objective control. Otherwise, I think I definitely could have ranked the Traitor Enforcer first. He's got kind of mediocre buffs for a unit of traitor guardsmen that you don't really want to be trying to support too much. They're just not going to be one of the units that really deserves a character to lead them, and are just grunts to put on points. The Lord Discordant, even with a fairly big points cut, didn't really help himself out too much. Vastor the Archifane also feels underwhelming, and perhaps the Noctilith Crown I think is kind of borderline use. At least it does have a 4+ invulnerable save aura, which could be handy for predators or something, but again for the most part it's quite a lot to ask for 125 points for something that doesn't do much else. For the Thousand Sons, I'd perhaps rank the Helldrake as standout underwhelming. 195 points and having less threat than the standard Chaos Marine variants can have with their Dark Packs, meaning that its damage output really is pretty pitiful, unless you just happen to be going against something that's got the fly keyword, as its talons can be pretty good against them I guess. Even then though, I'd rate it as just getting the damage into kind of okay for around about 200 points, as opposed to really exciting though. Otherwise, his special rule is stripping cover for the units that he gets to attack, which I don't think is really that interesting in the context of the Thousand Sons army. They maybe don't go in for big focus shooting gun lines where they care about that too much, and even if they did, then 200 points for the rule just really is too much. Overall, it's just paying a bit too much of a speed and utility tax. It could go down by a very, very large points margin, I think. Otherwise, beyond more generic demon engines and things, perhaps for their actual unique units, maybe the Zangors could be worth a mention. They are one of the units that most rarely sees play in top tournament lists and things, though in reality I really don't think that they're all that terrible for the cost. 65 points for 10 wounds at toughness 4 with a 6+ invulnerable save, getting OC 2, and potentially farming some Cabal points I think isn't the worst, and I think that you can make arguments for them above standard cultists if you want some very slightly more sturdier and threatening chaff units. Otherwise, for the Death Guard, I'd perhaps give it to their unique fortification, the Miasmic Malignifier, for 115 points. That's an infiltration fortification with a -1 to hit, and then a fairly small close-range shooting attack. Again, like the other durability fortifications, doesn't really add too much to the board, I don't think. And compared with the rest of the Death Guard army, it's not really all that hard to kill for this points cost either. So if the opponent desperately did care about that -1 to hit, it's maybe not the hardest in the world to remove anyway. Otherwise, for lesser interesting units, maybe the Defiler has a bit too strong competition from the other demon engines out there, and a few of the support characters just seem kind of badly balanced. Maybe out of the Virion members, the Plague Surgeon just seems to be a character that you'd rarely want to go for when there's some very good alternatives already. You're kind of banking on your squad getting injured but not destroyed, which definitely isn't going to be guaranteed in 10th edition, with focus fire coming in from much of an army if you're out front and centre. Otherwise, for the World Eaters, I feel like the slightly more boring answer is again probably the Helldrake and Defiler are some of the least interesting, again for the reasons mentioned for the Death Guard and Thousand Sons. Similarly, the Helldrake is just kind of weak threat, and the World Eaters can also super rush with a whole bunch of units already, maybe making it a little bit less of a point for its value. You could still be getting first turn charges with things like 8 bound that cost far less and will actually break something very nastily. For the Defiler, it's a 14 wound walker with some mixed range and melee threat between a battle cannon and some claws that do fairly well against things like enemy knights or heavy things. I feel like across the Chaos factions though it is just overcosted for what it does. Probably isn't the furthest away from the entire thing being sort of usable. It is let down by a sort of underwhelming special rule for crawling over bits of terrain though. Otherwise though, for the actual World Eater specific units, things that they have their own specific kits for, I feel like pretty much literally everything is really quite tempting. You might not want to go overboard on units like Jackals for example, but they still do their role fine, and Khan the Betrayer after his points cut is genuinely a pretty threatening character to throw at the enemy, either with some nervous berserkers or even solo. Perhaps the Terminators, which aren't really unique models, do feel like they're a bit eclipsed by the core faction units. I feel like their numbers just don't really compare quite as solidly to things like 8 bound. For the Demons, I'm probably just going to focus on the fortifications, as they do feel a bit standout bad within the index. The Skull Altar and the Feculent Narmor are both infiltrating fortifications that give a buff to things nearby. The Skull Altar gives you reroll Battle Shock to Khorne units only and projects a bubble of shadow in the warp to 6 inches around it. The Narmor gives you Stealth for Nurgle Demons. Both of those rules are okay. Stealth would make Nurgle Demons a touch more tanky, though the Narmor really doesn't have all that much defense of its own for 100 points, it could just get shot down. The Skull Altar's Shadow in the Warp could be pretty interesting for delivering units into combat, at least it's a touch tankier. I just feel like for 100 points the aura of the extension of Shadow of Chaos maybe is just too much for that, on a fortification that's basically going to be doing very little else. Seems particularly bad if you've got Be'lakor as well, who can get you some Shadow of Chaos anyway. Finally for Chaos, we've got the Chaos Knights. I feel like from the core index, it's hard to talk about anything but the Abominant for 455 points. This thing just seems strangely overcosted compared with the other big knights, which in their own turn aren't really considered to be the stars of the codex, at least in raw strength at the moment. Probably its biggest issue is its Volkite main gun, which is just a bit horribly swingy. It gets 9 shots at strength 12, but they're all at AP 0 with devastating wounds, so while occasionally you might roll a couple of 6s on the wound rolls and punch through some good damage, a lot of the time you might roll a bit poorly and it just does absolutely literally nothing. I'd say its melee isn't awful, but isn't quite as general purpose as some of the other knights there. It will bully Terminators quite well, though it's not going to pose as big a threat to enemy tough targets that it might be wounding on a 5+. Otherwise, it can force a battle shock test, which is more relevant in Chaos Knights than most, particularly round 3 and onwards. And the Warp Storms are okay for a little bit of chip damage, not really going to amount to much, but should probably be good for at least a little bit of damage at some point in the game. Overall though, I feel like this one could get a very significant points decrease to try and bring it more into line with the other Titanic Knights out there that probably also need to go down a little bit to compete with War Dogs. Otherwise, again, I'll probably mention the Chaos Knight Acheron, similar to the Imperial version for Forge World, basically a great big flame cannon that's not really all that punchy and can't do Overwatch anymore, and even his Battle Shock debuff is clunky and hard to use, relying on War Dogs being nearby and also in combat. Onto the Xenos, and while the Aeldari might have a good number of god tier units, they do have some underwhelming stuff too. Perhaps one of the most obvious from their core model range would be the Storm Guardians for 115 points. I think perhaps mainly due to them having a surprisingly disappointing melee attack for the average ones, to attack strength 3, AP 0 and damage 1. Not sure why they're quite so poor to be honest. I'd expect something like an AP -1 or 3 attacks or both. And even then they'd only be a threat to light infantry rather than a threat to literally nothing. Otherwise they do have some power weapons and fusion guns and flamers seeded within the unit, and they get the sticky objectives rule with a 5+ and vulnerable save. I'd say sticky objectives is probably the single best reason to take a unit of them. You could have them start within range of your primary objective and then move towards the midfield to try and get it to work there. Still though, pretty much all competitive lists that I've seen have avoided them. They're just very costly for what they do for both their damage and defense, and thoroughly outshone by Guardian Defenders that can rustle you up some Fate dice and maybe guard a Farseer if you'd like. Otherwise, probably worth mentioning the Webway Gate into the entries of many underwhelming fortifications. Again, in reality, this one probably should be the actual winner for worst unit, given that it's 220 points for one big cool archway that acts as nothing more than a fairly straightforward unit delivery system. Realistically, the Storm Guardians do have more utility than that, but it is true that Games Workshop seems to overcost just about every fortification that they have. Maybe they're just a touch less interesting to talk about. Next up for the Drukhari, probably the Succubus could be worth mentioning. Her buffs really aren't too bad on paper. Fights first and sustained hits 1 for witches are an okay damage boost, plus being able to fight first does make them harder to charge for some units. I'd say the biggest problem is though that she doesn't really add to the core problem that witches have, in that they just don't really do much damage against anything besides light infantry, maybe threatening standard Space Marines and power armor at a push. The damage boosts are good, but when they're just coming with a whole bunch of strength 3 attacks, people aren't going to care too much, and she doesn't really help out with that all that much herself, only having strength 3, AP 2 and damage 1 on her profile, though admittedly anti-infantry 3+. Currently I feel like witches just maybe aren't the unit that most people are wanting to build around from a damage perspective, so damage support characters aren't as interesting, and she's also competing with Lilith Hesperax, who is actually genuinely fairly good. More impressive flurries of combat attacks, and helps them by making them a little bit stronger and more attacks, overall far more damage. Otherwise though, again as one of the weakest armies in the game, Drukhari have loads to choose from. Hellions, Reavers, Incubi, Witches, the Raisin Wing Jet Fighter and Grotesques. I'd rank all as units that could do with points drops or ability boosts. The Drukhari are certainly a faction that could use a little bit of help. For the Tyranids, Games Workshop seems to have point costed the Spore Mines to the extent where they really don't want anyone to buy in a unit of these to actually add to their army. I feel like for raw damage and defense these guys might be pushing for single worst unit in the game. 55 points for 3 wounds at toughness 1 with no save is just hilariously easy to kill, even for maybe a couple of enemy light infantry. They only blow up if the enemy gets very close to them, and when they do, they only have on average 1 mortal wound of damage output. Unless they manage to hit something ridiculously elite, then they're probably not going to kill as many points as the unit cost in the first place. They can slow down enemy advances, and they do deep strike, In theory, that could mean that they could have a little bit of utility, but in reality, you never really want to take a unit of these when you could just farm them out of biovores. It makes far more sense just to include a single biovore and have that be a way of creating these little nuisance units, throwing them out to do secondaries or slow down an enemy advance into the midfield for free, rather than paying a ridiculous cost for the privilege. Otherwise, Tyranids got a whole load of fairly bizarre changes at the Codex, a bunch of stuff that hopefully they decide to put right in the next January update. The Spore Assists and Mucolids are kind of similar sort of level to the Spore Mines in my opinion. Harpies and Hive Crones are flyers that are weirdly overcosted for what they do. The Tyrannifex really didn't need a 50-point nerf to turn it from a good unit into a bad one. And there's plenty of stuff that just feels in the sort of underwhelming bracket, maybe things like the Toxicrene or the Screamer Killer for how many points it costs. Lots of stuff that could use a bit of a boost. For the Genestealer Cults, I'd argue that at least the majority of their stuff is somewhat usable, though there are definitely some things that overshadow the rest in the battle line units, maybe infiltrating aberrants and the primers and things. I feel like the bottom spot really isn't in any real debate though, with the mages taking that. 50 points for a leader character with an unreliable -1 to hit debuff in the enemy shooting phase, and then very little else beyond that, and they're competing against so many other fairly good units within the Genestealer Cults to lead units, maybe the Primus and Nexos for units to lead squads, but they've got lots of other good support characters beyond that. Otherwise, for more core units that are overcosted at the moment, I'd probably rank the Goliath Rock Grinder and the Hybrid Metamorphs. Both of those I've rarely seen in tournament lists just due to probably needing some points off or an ability boost. The Rock Grinder does have some good damage, but it's just very fragile and easy to gun down for the over 150 points it costs. For the Leagues of Votann, I'd similarly say that as quite a strong faction at the moment, pretty much all of their shortlist of units are rather good and do tend to crop up in competitive games. Arguably, perhaps most dwarfed in power by the other options though is Uthar the Destined. 90 points for a character that I'd argue might be worse than the Carl overall. He does some similar sort of things with a 5+ invulnerable save and his grim efficiency, though instead of getting lethal hits for the unit that he leads, he instead trades that for a little bit more personal damage threat. His sword's a bit more threatening, and he has an automatic 6s rule to allow him to punch up a bit and get an automatic devastating wound. He is kind of impressively hard to kill for some targets. He did quite well against the Avatar of Cain per point when I did that big damage contest, as he reduces the damage output to 1 for attacks suffered by him. In general though, if he's getting attacked like that, the rest of his squad is already dead, and is probably not going to be in the best position in the first place. Between all that, he just seems to be very rarely picked compared with the standard Carl and the Iron Here champion for leading things like Hearthguard. Otherwise, beyond them, I feel like Hearthkin Warriors might be one of the more underwhelming units of the index. Certainly not unusable for small squads riding in Sagittars, at least you get some fairly cheap units on the boards that way, but they do feel like a unit that you'd take to justify the transport as opposed to the other way around, which maybe doesn't feel the most exciting. For the Tau Empire, and maybe feeling in a similar sort of vein to the Tyranid Spore Mines, Games Workshop seems to not want you to take tactical drones individually, charging a ridiculous 70 points for 4 of them. So that's almost 20 points per Toughness 3 body with a 4+ save, armed with an inaccurate Twin Pulse Carbine. I guess they do Deep Strike innately, maybe Games Workshop wanted them to just not be filling the role of easy secondary doers, and leave that to things like Vespid, but they certainly seem to have achieved that in any case. It almost feels like they're a bit of a placeholder unit for any other units that might be able to detach drones, not that that seems to be a thing in the current index though. Otherwise I feel like there's good arguments that you could make for the majority of the index in competitive lists. Maybe the tide wall fortifications tend to be particularly neglected. I guess having a sort of slow moving transport that you can fire out of can be alright, but probably just a bit too slow, and having OC0 doesn't help. Otherwise the Kroot Shaper isn't the best for units that you don't really want to be spending more points on to buff, and the Far Stalkers just don't have much damage output. I wouldn't really be looking at them as much when there's other infiltrating things about, like say Tetras or Stealth Suits. For Necrons, it's early days in the Codex at the moment, but even with that, not that many datasheets really changed too much, and it still looks like the Obelisk is a unit that they just haven't done enough to help out, even if its Gravity Well rule did get a touch better, allowing you to now half the movement of the thing that it targets, as opposed to -2 from it. It's still a super heavy that costs 325 points, and isn't going to be doing much damage to anything bar lighter infantry with those Tesla spheres. And even with a slowing rule that is actually kind of good now, it's not going to compare too well to the Monolith that gets good damage and the Eternity Gate, or the new and upgunned Tesseract Vault with its 4+ invulnerable save, and now getting 2 Catan powers rather than 1. Either of those seems well worth the upgrade if you are taking a super heavy. Otherwise, I feel like Cryptothralls have gone from heroes to really being underwhelming. 60 points for 3 wound things without the feel no pain is sad, and they can't be joining their favourite places anymore in the Lich Guard, seeing as Technomancers can't join them. The Night Side still feels a bit on the pointless side as a transport. I guess could deliver something for an Alpha Strike turn 2, but even then you'd risk the chance of it getting shot down if it just turns up somewhere on the board turn 1, plus its flight path would be predictable. I still was rather disappointed that they didn't do anything better with Trazyn the Infinite. He basically gives the sticky objective special rule and doesn't really do much else. Bad defense and his ability to take over another Necron character is probably not something that you want to bother with, given that most of the time he's just going to be replacing something that was more use than him. Finally, for the Orks, I'd probably give the award to the Burner Bomber. Again, a massive victim of Games Workshop's new flyer rules and hasn't really had any points redresses to make up for that. Like the other Orky planes, he'll be turning up turn 2 at the earliest. When he gets there, his shooting damage output will be kind of awful with the gun profiles that he has and ballistic skill 5+. He does pay his main premium for his bombs, and then the opponent will know exactly where he's got the option of dropping the bombs given which way he's facing, and even if they do, they probably won't care too much, as he's got one of the options where you just get 6s for a mortal wound on every model in the squad, so it's not very general purpose, and only gets up to kind of mediocre damage against hordes of 20 models or so. Pretty much an awful datasheet the entire way round, unless Games Workshop change flyer rules or drop the points to frankly kind of silly levels. I do kind of wonder what sort of points cost would get these taken competitively. It might literally be something around about half this price tag perhaps. Otherwise, the other Orky flyers, perhaps particularly the Blitzer Bomber, aren't really in a much better space. Tank Busters have a fairly garbage mixed unit profile and still cost too much for what they do, though at least it's mercifully a tiny bit better than it was at the start of 10th. The fortifications, again, I'd rate as kind of underwhelming, particularly in the context of Orky army lists that tend to go heavy on the melee rush things. The Stomper is and always will be overcosted, and currently several of the buggies again were kind of weird that they didn't get points drops in the last update, though fingers crossed when the Codex turns up they'll have a bit more support for Speed War or Orky firepower in general. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed a few thoughts as to some of the weakest units in the game of 40k right now. As mentioned, let me know anything else that you think might have made this list but didn't, or any fixes that you might want to do for these units, whether it's points or some sort of new special rule or rewritten datasheet. As always, I look forward to having a read of your comments down below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.